We showed some of the clips to the wrestler many kids idolize, Mick Foley, known as Mankind.
That looks like fun. I mean, that's no different than kids going out and playing tackle football when they really should be playing touch football. Should the kids be hitting each other with garbage cans? Probably not, but they all look like they're friends. I don't think they're doing anything out of anger. I wasn't so crazy about the light bulbs to the head.
When a guy breaks his neck in football, they say...
Hold on. Yes, sir. Very quickly, what do you want to say?
From the beginning of the show, everyone has had a negative comment. These kids are living out a dream. Icon, Hex, Suicide Kid, Hillbilly Jim, Arachnid. They're living out their dreams. You don't tell an actor not to be an actor.
Take a bow, sir. Take a bow. All right. Next.
Backyard wrestling is defined as an underground, unofficial hobby and sport, which involves participating in professional style wrestling in a low budget environment. And this is usually done by kids or young adults. It's typically done in a backyard, a basement, or a garage with makeshift rings. Sometimes they don't even have a ring. It's basically, just a grassy patch of ground with some ropes around it or marked off. And then backyard wrestling is typically organized into small groups or federations. And most of the participants in backyard wrestling aren't formally trained, and they learn the wrestling moves and the technique by visual emulation, and they practice the moves of their favorite wrestlers. Now, this isn't really a big thing anymore for a couple reasons. One, wrestling is just not as popular anymore. And the second reason is the Generation Z, Gen Z, the Zoomers, they are very soft compared to early millennials, or even some Generation X that might have done backyard wrestling growing up. But for a while there, like I said, during the late 90s and early 2000s, it was kind of a big deal. The media would often cover it and talk about how dangerous it was, how kids could get injured or even killed. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today is, was doing this really that dangerous? Did it really result in, a lot of wrestling fatalities? So that's what we're going to take a look at today. But going back into the history of it, I guess really one of the best examples or the earliest examples I could give you of this style of wrestling was the NWF. It launched in the mid-'80s in Anoka, Minnesota. A guy named Sean Crossan started it when he was a kid. And they were a lot more organized than most backyard wrestling groups. They even had a local access cable TV show. They used the stage, the studio kind of as their own ring. And then they eventually got a real professional wrestling ring and put on a couple of shows at an actual armory. So you didn't really see the death match stuff from them that got all the media hype in the late 90s, early 2000s. But that's really an early example of this style of wrestling. And going back even further, I would say kids have probably been wrestling since the dawn of time, because really it's the oldest sport and oldest self-defense style on the planet. It's kind of like our built-in self-defense system. So that form of primitive wrestling has been going on probably since the dawn of time. And, kids were just doing this to, test their skills for sport. But it wasn't really this work style, professional wrestling style that you see with a lot of backyard wrestling. And that brings me to my next point. There are two types of backyard wrestling. There's like a shoot style where you're just kind of like having unofficial amateur wrestling matches. And the winner isn't actually predetermined, but then again, you're not trying to hurt your opponent either, because, both of you are probably friends and you're just testing your skill testing your wrestling skills against each other. And the second form is the more true form of backyard wrestling. It's where they are actually working the match like a professional style wrestling match. So let's get into this in the media sensationalism that often really vilified boys participating in backyard wrestling. And to me, this is just another example of how, hysteria and this really feminine overreaction to things was just kind of used to demonize boys being boys. Because often deaths were cited as the reason as why this shouldn't be done on these shows. The problem, though, is when you start to research backyard wrestling deaths, they lump in cases that aren't really examples of wrestling matches. For example, Lionel Tate is probably the most well-known example. And this is an example of an older kid basically beating up a much younger female, a toddler, and doing wrestling moves on her. So on one hand, you have kids working matches in their backyard that may be dangerous, that may be prone to injury because they're doing death match style stuff, using weapons, etc. And then on the other hand, you have these examples they're trying to use as deaths, but they are really just, either somebody older snapping and actually trying to hurt someone younger and more vulnerable. So that's really an example of media dishonesty there. And secondly, also, if you research backyard wrestling deaths, you find very few. I'm sure there have been some. There have been a lot of injuries, but that's the case with every sport. To be honest, I've found more serious injuries during my research in regards to children playing football and paralysis. And I've also found more examples of paralysis in amateur organized wrestling matches than I have these backyard wrestling matches. So backyard wrestling was unfairly demonized. And I think ABC did a broadcast on it. They had Mick Foley on as a guest, and this would have been the late 90s. And he essentially defended backyard wrestling as well. He said, yeah, maybe they shouldn't be using as many weapons and taking that level of risk. But he said, it looked like they were all friends and just having fun, which was kind of my take too, because I participated in backyard wrestling matches when I was younger, and it was just about having fun. And now kids are so soft and coddled, you really don't see them doing stuff like that anymore. And then there was an example of the Ricky Lake show covering it. Most of the audience were giving the backyard wrestlers negative feedback. One guy actually stood up and encouraged them, and that brought on some backlash from the crowd that was really against it. But it's just funny how it was so overly demonized in that period from the late 90s to early 2000s, and now you hardly ever see it. But that's my take on backyard wrestling. This is going to be part of a broader project because I'm going to do some writing on the topic and go deeper into the history of it, because it's really fascinating to look into. But on the issue of wrestling fatalities, most of what I have found have been actual crimes. There have been some accidents in backyard wrestling, of course. There have been some accidents in amateur wrestling matches. But I would say the risk is higher of kids playing football than it is with anything we've seen from backyard wrestling. And then the other argument is, well, not as many kids were doing backyard wrestling as, playing football. While that's true, this point still remains. There is risk with everything you do. And with raising boys especially, you shouldn't shelter them, you shouldn't coddle them. You need to allow them to take risk Yes, put in some reasonable boundaries and encourage reasonable boundaries, but we shouldn't contain them, because that's what makes masculine and strong men, is taking risk, learning from it, and being brave, daring, and bold, and going after what you want. So that's my thoughts on backyard wrestling. It's kind of a shame that, the feminization of society has happened, but that's where we're at. And it's an interesting period of history to look back on, that era of the late 90s, early 2000s. And like I said, I'll have more on this topic soon.